Hey, it's Ryan from Ryonet, and today we're going to show you 3 ways to dial in your screen print emulsion exposure. The 3 ways we're going to show you is a step wedge test, and we're going to show you an emulsion exposure calculator, which is a very simple one. Basically, it's called a Stouffer's wedge test, and then also a more advanced exposure calculator. Both these exposure calculators are available from our website and from Ryonet. So we're going to do all 3 of these in the same way and really show you how to dial in your exposure times. Now, the most cheapest way to do it is a step wedge test. And we have information on our website and our help desk on how to do this. So we're going to go over this. So for this, what you're going to do is essentially you're going to step off your emulsion. So right here we have a fully unexposed screen coated with emulsion. Now you can use any mesh size. Because we're using some of the exposure calculators, I'm actually using like a 230 mesh. But you can use a 156, a 110, really whatever. Next, we're going to need some opaque paper, or a black trash bag, or even a film positive printed completely black. Whatever this is, you should not be able to see any light through it. So we're going to put our paper over different segments of the emulsion. So right here, we're putting our paper over 2/3 of the screen. And what a step wedge test does, it essentially allows us to do different burn times and burn tests in 3 to 4 areas of the screen. So there's my blocked off screen area. I'm just going to take some tape and tape down my paper so that it does not leave the screen there. And then we'll put it in for exposure. Now, what we're doing is we're starting our exposure time at 2 minutes. We'll go from 2 minutes to 3 minutes to 4 minutes. Now, depending on the type of emulsion and your exposure light source, the more powerful your light source, the lower your variance is. So for instance, if I was using a 501 halogen light to expose this, I would actually probably do 4 step wedges at 2 minutes apart each. Because I have a little bit higher powered UV exposure unit here, I'm going to do 3 step wedges at only 1 minute apart each. So next we're going to do is we're going to put some film positives on. And the reason why we're putting these film positives on is we want to see how this exposes under the exposure light. So we're going to do 2 film positives with some basic detail in them. And then we're also going to put our 1 exposure calculator on there. Now, the reason why we're not going to put the advanced calculator is this advanced calculator actually blocks out the amount of light for us. So if you see right here, that's completely clear. But right here is 50% blockout of light. So this does the step wedge for us. This investment right here is huge. This is by far the best way to dial in your exposure times without having to do all this work. However, if you don't have this, you don't have that, and you want to do this on your own or manually, this is how you do it. Okay, so this is the X Factor exposure unit. We have light-safe viewing bulbs, which allow us to see what's going on without actually exposing the screen. So I make sure all my film's correct. I make sure that light's not getting through my paper, and we have a very opaque paper, so we're good to go. So we're going to start this exposure step wedge test at 2 minutes, then we're going to do 3 minutes, and then we're going to do 4 minutes. So we already set our exposure unit to 2 minutes right here with the analog timer. We'll put the vacuum down. Once the vacuum's sucked, we'll do our exposure time for 2 minutes. Okay, once our exposure is done, we'll simply turn our exposure unit off, and then we will take our step wedge to the next test. That's very simple to do. All we're doing is we're taking our film off, and because the way we laid this out, it makes it pretty easy. So what we're doing now is we're covering up the top where we already exposed, because that was in a 2-minute exposure unit. We don't need to expose that again. And then we're placing the film in the middle here, like so. So that's been exposed. We actually wrote down 2 minutes right there. And now we're going to expose the middle of it. So we're going to get some more black paper from either down here or just bring some more in to cover the bottom, so that this one will be a 3-minute exposure unit or exposure, and then this bottom we'll do a 4-minute exposure. All right, we have everything down and in place. We're going to go for a 3-minute exposure. So I'm dialing up to 3 minutes. vacuum. Once the vacuum's sucked down, we'll expose for 3 minutes. Okay, so we've done our 3-minute exposure test. Now, we'll do our final 4-minute exposure test. So for the 4-minute exposure test, we're going to do something a little different. For this test, I'm just going to mark the edge of the screen right here so I know where my exposure was. Right there. For this test, we're actually going to use the additional exposure calculator. So we put that back over there. Okay, and I'm going to take this small exposure calculator and put it down here. And then I'm going to use my advanced exposure calculator, which is my preferred one, because this does the step wedge automatically for us. And I'm going to put that on this side of the screen right here. So I'm just going to take this film off because there's no space for it. I'm going to put that on this side of the screen right here. So this is accomplishing, we're going to do a test right there. We have 2 exposure calculators, and we're going to do a full 4-minute test. Now, once again, the advantage to this right here is that this exposure calculator, even though it's a little bit more expensive, I think it's $30-some, not too bad. This exposure calculator actually does the step wedge automatically for us. So if we were using this, that's why we're using this with only 1 exposure, because that's all we need to use it for, is just 1 exposure. So make sure that's all nice and covered there. And then we're going to expose this now. Oops. Expose this now for 4 minutes. Now this is one way to do it, and the way we're showing it right here is we're actually doing it because we're doing multiple exposures with the exposure calculators. But we're also going to show you another way to do it with 1 job that works consistently with 1 job. So there we go there. Once again, we're doing for 4 minutes now. All right, after this, we'll show you how to do the other style, and then we'll wash out. Okay, now our exposure is complete. So what we've done, once again here, is we have 3 different exposure segments. We have 2 minutes on the top, 3 minutes, and then 4 minutes. The 4-minute one using the more advanced exposure calculator, so we can show you how that rinses out. All 3 of them using the basic Stouffer step wedge, which is about $12 for this guy, very cheap. I would at least have this in your shop. And then all showing the step wedge exposure parameters. So one other way we wanted to show you how to do this is if you're using the step wedge exposure on the same image. So let's say we have just 1 image on the screen like so, like you see here. Well, this image is taped down to the screen and exposed. We can actually do our step wedge test on this film positive by basically going like this. So what we do now is if we're going to use the step wedge exposure test on just 1 film positive, which should be a little bit bigger, should cover the whole screen, kind of dial in the exposure time basically just based off of a visual look and a feel of how the emulsion was exposed. As we have our film positive, we put our black tape over and then we'd expose for 1 minute. Okay, so this area would be exposed for 1 minute. Then we'd expose this area right here for 2 minutes. Okay, so that means this area is now going to be exposed for 3 minutes, and this area will be exposed for 2 minutes. Then we need to expose the entire screen for another 2 minutes, which means this would now be exposed for 5 minutes, this would be now exposed for 3 minutes, and this would be exposed for 2 minutes. So it gives us some variance in time here with a 5 minutes of exposure, 3 minutes of exposure, and 2 minutes of exposure based around how we took this off. The film stays in the same spot because you have it taped down, and you can base off of how good it washes out and how slimy the emulsion is on back, which 5-minute, 3-minute, or 2-minute exposure works best for this emulsion. Now, depending on the type of emulsion that you're using, it's going to vary. So this is a dual cure emulsion, so we're exposing longer. If we're using a photopolymer emulsion, those times would be much shorter, but the concept is the same. So in the washout booth, we're now going to get the screen wet and let it soak. Get it wet on both sides and we'll let it soak for about 30 seconds to a minute. what we're going to do now is we're going to rinse out and we're going to explain to you the different parameters around all the washouts. So with the step wedge test, we're basically looking at what area washes out the best. We can judge that by how the emulsion feels on the inside. Does it feel slimy or does it feel smooth? And how well the edge definition is retained in the image. So with strictly a step wedge test, we're just looking at the images that we exposed. The Stouffer step wedge test, which is that little emulsion exposure sheet, we're wanting to get the optional density of 7. So that means if we don't get to 7, we're underexposing. If we go over 7, we're overexposing. So we get to optimal 7 and we're good. Now, the CCI exposure calculator or the advanced exposure calculator, we'll explain that too when we get down to the bottom. So remember, we had a 2-minute exposure, 3-minute, and 4-minute. All right, so here are our results. Now, honestly, all of the images washed out just fine. The emulsion is not slimy either on any of the images. So 2 minutes on this image, I would have said would have worked just perfect. Now, this image also worked just fine at 3 minutes. This image worked fine at 4 minutes. Now, that's a nice part about a dual cure emulsion is it's friendly. You can expose it for a little bit longer as long as you have good films and it still washes out just fine. You can expose it for shorter, and as long as you have good films, it still washes out just fine. What we'd want to be careful of is slimy emulsion. If our emulsion was very slimy and running back into the screen right here, this area would be underexposed. Now, what we're seeing here is also the step wedge test. Remember how we had to get to 7 points? Well, even on the lowest exposure, we're all the way up at 13. That's letting too much light through and not washing out right there. So this is overexposed right here. We could actually lower the exposure time down. This right here is obviously going to be worse because it's longer. This right here is even worse yet. And even down here on the density wedge scale, right here we have an exposure that is 1.5. So this exposed the best on this CCI density scale, and this blocked out 50% of the exposure light, but still didn't expose enough. So with this specific screen right here, we've exposed it for way too long, meaning that we'd want to do another step wedge test to bump the exposure time down. Now, if we're just doing spot color images, obviously the 2-minute exposure time would be what I would go with because I wouldn't have any other way to tell. All I would know is this emulsion's not slimy, and my spot color artwork worked out great. We got good edge definition, we got good detail in some of the smaller fonts. When we really overexposed the screen, which I could tell with a more advanced exposure calculator, and I could really tell with the best exposure calculator. So there's 3 different ways to expose a screen right here and test your emulsion exposure times. You can use any of them in your shop. The more advanced methods are going to allow you to do it a little bit more, extensively. Because basically, right here, we know that this washed out to step 12. I need to dial down my exposure time so many seconds or so much percentage per each step. And those percentages are located on the exposure unit or exposure step wedge instructions. Same thing goes with this. I need to dial down my exposure time at least 50%, which is actually still overexposed because, as you can see here, this bottom one's overexposed. So a way that you can actually go in there and do all these different exposures. Now, to find out more details on specifically how to use the step wedge test, how to use the advanced exposure calculator, how to use the basic exposure calculator, you can visit our help desk and you can search on how to use any of these and you'll get written documents on how to do so. I hope you guys have enjoyed this video and learned a lot. Check out more information on Ryonet's help desk available at support.silkscreensupplies.com.